Hey, Internet, welcome back to another episode of New Foundations, the podcast brought to you by Acropolis, the Bitcoin Treasury company. We have a packed house today. I've got Chase, Bobby, and we have two special guests, Tim Kotzman and Dan Hillery, both of which are very prominent figures in the MicroStrategy community. So I'll let them give an intro. Tim, why don't you start?
Sure. So I have been on a Bitcoin journey since January 2021, and I started discovering it, MicroStrategy, the stock, not just Michael Saylor talking on podcasts every day of my life, earlier this year. And I got connected with Dan through mutual friends. And along the journey, interviewing Dan and others, I think started a podcast that's now the Bitcoin Treasury's podcast. So a lot of similar and overlapping themes here. So happy to be here.
Hey guys, yeah, my name's Dan Hillery. I'm a graduate student in electrical engineering at Brown University. I got interested in Bitcoin in 2021. I'd been investing since I was 18 years old, and was fortunate enough to go all in with leverage at 18K a coin. And all the while, I'd been trading options on my own time. I had been looking into quantitative trading for all throughout my college years. It's something that a lot of engineering students kind of gravitate towards. So I was familiar with options, and then for some reason, one thing led to another, and I started playing MSTR options starting last year, and yeah, it's just taken off from there. So I'm excited to talk MSTR, excited to talk options, and everything between.
Yeah, it's really great to have you both on. We're excited to chop it up, talk MSTR today, dive into the recent earnings call, which was absolutely legendary. But I think, probably listeners have a good sense of what MSTR is up to, but just to kind of set the foundation here, Dan, why don't you start us off by just explaining how Saylor and MSTR's Bitcoin Treasury strategy kind of started as a defensive strategy and has turned into an offensive strategy.
Sure, guys, fill in anywhere if there's any small things I get wrong or I'm omitting. But as I understand, it started in August of 2020, where Saylor had about $500 million worth of cash on their balance sheet, and their business wasn't growing. As a result, they were looking for a way to deploy this capital in a way that was accretive and would grow the business. And mergers and acquisitions are inherently risky and tend to fail. They're not usually successful. And he could return it to the shareholders, but that's essentially admitting defeat. And so he looked for an accretive asset and an investment that would return his money. And for publicly traded companies, there's a limit. I think it's 60% of your overall balance sheet can't be in securities or a single security. I forget exactly the designation there. But so he was looking for a commodity, an asset, an investment. And Bitcoin, he wasn't a proponent in 2013, but he eventually turned the tide, did some research, and put half of that 500 million into Bitcoin, and half I think he returned to shareholders. And so that started his relentless Bitcoin acquisition journey. And I think the most important part for people listening and people following this whole evolution of MicroStrategy is that it's evolved. This idea of a Bitcoin treasury company has evolved. At the beginning, it was more of just a defensive holding strategy. It was for MicroStrategy to increase their cash reserves. Now it's become an entire sort of leveraging the balance sheet to create this volatility product that people don't really have a full understanding of. This is not an ETF. This is much different than an ETF. This has become something much, much greater, more so a fixed income product and a volatility product that's been inserted into the capital markets in a way which no other company has created this sort of vehicle for trading before.
People often talk about how MicroStrategy cannot be caught at this point, but they're now about 150% Bitcoin. What is it about MicroStrategy that allowed them to become 150% Bitcoin, and what is it that's unique about their business or their size or their time as a public company and their existing product offering and revenue that allows them to become this levered play in the public markets?
Yeah, I guess I'll just start off by saying the obvious, or what has kind of been recycled around a lot recently, which is that if Apple or Microsoft bought just as much Bitcoin as MicroStrategy currently has, that would still be maybe 10%, a very insignificant amount of their total operation. So to your point, the leverage long through a combination of debt and equity, along with MicroStrategy's relatively small size, call it $50 billion, give or take, on the way to a goal of $1 trillion company. It just puts it in a very unique position.
I'm curious. So at the beginning, it was more of a strategy to bolster the balance sheet. Around what time did they exactly begin, leveraging everything to acquire more? When did that switch?
The way I understand it is that it wasn't really like a conscious decision. It just started happening as they began issuing equity with this premium over their, because obviously during the last bull market, their premium kind of expanded, right? And their market capitalization was trading at a premium to their underlying holdings. And this is a tool that they can use to make accretive purchases of Bitcoin for their shareholders. And that's something we can talk more about. But what's so interesting is how that kind of naturally evolved. And now, as Saylor and the team has been developing the strategy, I think they've been looking into more tools and they've obviously put forth this key performance metric, which is Bitcoin per share yield. And so they've been using the premium fixed income products to increase the amount of Bitcoin without diluting shareholders faster than the rate of increase. And so I think it's just been a natural progression over time.
Yeah, I think Saylor has even said himself, it kind of started off as defensive and then went to opportunistic, and now it's strategic. Maybe with the new plan, you call it aggressive. So, yeah.
Yeah.
The question I had to just get a first question in was becoming a Bitcoin bank. Like, he's brought that up. I am very curious if he talked about that on the call in detail, because Bitcoin, you don't need a bank for Bitcoin, but they want to be the Bitcoin bank, and it seems there's this like institutional demand. Can you guys unpack that? And if he did not cover it in the earnings call, maybe just share what your views are on that idea in general.
Yeah, I'll throw a few ideas out there. I know Cantor Fitzgerald at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, they said, we own a shitload of Bitcoin, and we're going to be rolling out products where you can maybe take out a loan against your Bitcoin. So at least for me, that's where, I think there's a dozen different things that could be rolled out with a Bitcoin bank. To me, it's having a credible, like a JP Morgan level institution where you can somehow have them either hold or somehow collateralize your Bitcoin and lend, take out a loan against it and kind of do the buy, borrow, die model where you don't have to sell your Bitcoin, you can just use it as digital property.
And the thing that comes to mind is I talked to some of the Bitcoin companies that have done lending of Bitcoin like over the last 4 to 5 years, and I just say, like, why is the rate to borrow not cheaper? And the short answer is the people that provide the capital ask for the 12 or 14% or whatever it is, where in my mind, I'm not really into the idea of lending out Bitcoin unless it was like much lower. And that's a personal thing, that could be debated whether it's good or bad, like what the rate is. But I think one thing that comes to mind with MicroStrategy and hearing your answer is they're putting together this playbook of how to manage dollars in debt and all these different things to buy more Bitcoin, and they're executing on it over and over again, showing that they can do it well, at least in the current state of the economy, that it's almost like this big white paper and case study as to why we should be the organization that becomes your Bitcoin bank, and it could long term be the thing that brings more capital into Bitcoin. And I would imagine on the other side of the deal, if I'm coming to borrow, on the other side of the deal, there's got to be a Bitcoin denominated yield for lending. Maybe not. Danny, maybe you could kind of touch on that. Like, is that possible?
I think it's like a really pertinent question. I think you're totally spot on. What is this idea of a bank? And Saylor's talked about this a bit, but it's very unclear. And I think Bitcoin investment bank is almost a better way to phrase it, because a lot of people, or even myself, I was like, okay, are they going to be lending out Bitcoin and get a 5% yield? And Saylor's talked about that, similar to JP Morgan or what are the U.S. government issuing bonds. And I think at the current moment in time, the bank functions are these fixed income products, and that's what needs to be focused on. And for at least the next 5 years. I think there's so much demand in these capital markets of money that's locked up in these underperforming fixed income products, right? The fixed income market, including U.S. bonds, is $300 trillion. And whenever Saylor goes out and issues one of these convertible debt offerings, or even just a normal fixed income product, right, like a senior note that's returning 5% to the investors, these products are super accretive for Saylor. They're super accretive for shareholders, and they give the investors what they're looking for, right? In the case of convertible notes, the 80% of the upside of Bitcoin, or actually, it's been more than the upside of Bitcoin, 80% of the upside of MSTR stock equity, and very little downside. So I think these are the products that he's going to continue to focus on, and that's where he's going to continue getting this yield. I don't see him going and lending out this Bitcoin in any way in like a traditional sense of like, oh, someone will come and get a fixed rate and deposit their Bitcoin. I could see him acting as an intermediary for large institutions to clear transactions in Bitcoin, right? Like a Fed funds rate type situation between banks where they're paying him an overnight interest rate to settle transactions, and he's clearing them with his giant Bitcoin stack. So I think more and more we're going to see this Bitcoin stack that's only getting larger and larger. And as Tim's saying, no one can really catch them, right? As it gets larger, they can leverage it both in issuing fixed income products and it acting as collateral for even small, not very risky settlement transactions between large parties.
Yeah, I think another interesting point here is that people often think that MicroStrategy is taking on debt to buy Bitcoin, but it's actually somewhere in the middle where they're using convertible debt and bonds. And so, Tim, maybe you can speak to this idea that the bond market sees MicroStrategy as a very appealing product because they can get their principal back with a very, very narrow interest rate on top of that, but that they essentially have a call option on the equity. And that if that equity runs away, which we've seen in every case of the convertible bond issuance so far, that those holders are essentially converting into shares because it's a much better return than just getting their principal back plus the 0.65% interest or whatever they were raising that tranche at. So maybe you can kind of speak to that and how it's not necessarily debt that the company has to pay back.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the convertible instruments, convertible bonds, and Dan, jump in if I get any of this wrong, they've been selling these converts at 30 to 40% above the current share price. And in the case of the zero coupon, it was 50% above. And so Ben Workman actually, over the last day or two, actually made a note. I don't know if it was on a external call or internal call, but that all of these convertible bonds will be, if they're not already eligible to convert over the next year or so into shares. And so I think my understanding is that's just part of the game is, yes, it's debt, but it's convertible debt that's going to convert at a certain price into shares. And there's different triggers, whether it's MicroStrategy or the counterparty that's going to exercise that right. Did I miss anything, Dan?
No, that was spot on. I love that. I love hitting on that point of the convertible debt being sold to a premium to the shares, which are already a premium to the Bitcoin, which is super advantageous for MicroStrategy.
I think, even just this morning on X, I think people are starting to understand how this engine or machine is operating just based off of posts and comments where it's like, okay, people are starting to wrap their head around it. And, it's not going to be another 6 months of people just like ignoring MicroStrategies. I think we're at a very unique point in time.
No, yeah, I think it's hard to believe that the market and the wider investment community doesn't catch on in the next 6 to 12 months, especially with MicroStrategy being the best performing stock over the last 4 years and their bonds being the best performing bonds. So let's talk about this 42 billion. Is there enough Bitcoin supply available for this 42 billion buy over the next 3 years? Is Saylor essentially converting his convertible debt into higher Bitcoin prices, which sends his equity higher because of his Bitcoin holdings. Is this truly a flywheel that can continue forever? Or is there something, maybe it's MNAV shrinking, that could stop this play?
So I think Dan or Bobby or Mason should talk about MNAV. But I mean, years ago, I feel like I heard someone make the statement that Saylor is just doing a leverage buyout of the Bitcoin network. And it's like genius. So like, yeah, there's enough Bitcoin for him to buy $42 billion worth of Bitcoin, but it's just a matter of at what market clearing price. I'll stop there.
I can't touch on MNAV. I would love someone to dive into that a lot more because honestly, like the MicroStrategy community and everything with MicroStrategy, I don't have time to study it the way you guys have. And I was joking earlier yesterday, and I tweeted it. I was like, anyone who's from class of 2022 Bitcoin that went leverage long MicroStrategy, hey, old Bitcoiners, can you stay humble and accept the fact they have more Bitcoin than you? Like, this is the greatest play of the last few cycles. And the thing that's like super interesting to me to touch on, I think it was the question Chase asked earlier, and then I'd love for someone to dive into the MNAV, is like MicroStrategy was a boring business with one guy who owned most of it, and he actually took a pretty humble approach to educate his entire team. After he bought Bitcoin, he didn't strong arm him into the decision. He allowed them to play a role. He came in and actually said, we'll buy your shares at a premium, like you guys touched on. And then they just executed the playbook, and it's worked phenomenally. And I think I would love to hear more on like the MNAV piece and like, can it be diminished? Because I think a guy named Mark online, I've seen him document it. He mentioned it went from 3.4 to like 3.1, I believe, just in the last week from these buys. Like, what does that specifically mean?
Dan is the man when it comes to MNAV, so I'll let him obviously take this one. I'll just add in that over the weekend, you know, I'm an ever optimist, so I sometimes get a little too excited, and I tweeted something like, if you like this Bitcoin price action over the weekend, just wait till Monday when the MNAV goes through the roof with MicroStrategy, right? Or goes up. And then yesterday, after Saylor announced the $2 billion plus of additional Bitcoin buys, like the MNAV went down, right? Because there's more Bitcoin per share. And so the MNAV went from, Dan might know it more accurately than I do, like 3.6 down to 3.1 or whatever. I'll figure it over to you, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and everyone fights about it online. I think like a lot of people don't even know what it means. And it's really like a simple traditional metric. Like price to book value is pretty much the metric we're talking about here. So MSTR has a market cap, which is the total value or the number of outstanding shares. We use fully diluted. So that means if all the convertible debt were to convert and all the outstanding options were to convert, that number of shares multiplied by the current price of MicroStrategy shares trading on the market, that's their total diluted market capitalization. And then you divide that by their Bitcoin holdings, the total value of their Bitcoin holdings minus their debt, right? So if you want to do multiple to net asset value, you have to divide the market capitalization by the net assets. So all their assets minus their liabilities. And so in our case, for the most part, their assets are their Bitcoin, their liabilities is their debt, right? And you take the difference of that, divide the market cap by that. And so it kind of shows a relative pricing of MicroStrategy stock to their Bitcoin holdings. And so I think the first point people get a little bit confused on is like, okay, MicroStrategy should trade at a 1x MNAV. Well, clearly they shouldn't because they have a leveraged Bitcoin product, right? They create leverage using this convertible debt. They have Bitcoin, they have debt. So that's leverage. And well, they have Bitcoin purchased with debt. So that's leverage. And as Bitcoin goes up, the debt will melt away. Now, as that occurs, right, their premium will expand. So it's hard to put a premium on that leverage, right? They have this leverage product, and the markets trade the shares trade in the free market. And so that's kind of the problem, right? Is like people want to put this premium on the company, but the shares trade in the free market. And there's a lot of different factors that influence the price of the shares relative to the price of the underlying Bitcoin. That may be passive flows of indexes, right? So indexes are these passive investing vehicles that are forced to buy companies based on their market capitalization weighting. And so as MicroStrategy's price increases, they'll increase their weighting in the MSCI World Index, which is one of the index in which they're included, which causes more money to flow into MicroStrategy in particular, not necessarily Bitcoin, right? The money due to this index will flow into MicroStrategy shares, which will pump their share price, but not necessarily the Bitcoin price. And obviously it all kind of works together, but there's all these different market factors affecting independently the price of Bitcoin and the price of MicroStrategy up here. And so this idea of MNAV is also important because the higher the MNAV, the higher Saylor can sell shares, right? Dilute his shareholders into the open market relative to his Bitcoin holdings. So for example, if MicroStrategy is trading at a 2x premium, right? So their market capitalization is twice that of their total net assets. Then when Saylor goes and sells shares into the market, he's essentially selling Bitcoin or selling the Bitcoin he owns at twice the current spot price. So right now it's 85K. So he's selling Bitcoin at 170K. And then when he uses those proceeds to go buy Bitcoin, he's buying Bitcoin at 85K. And so what that means for shareholders is that he can increase the total number of outstanding shares of MicroStrategy by about 5%, while increasing his Bitcoin holdings by 10%, simply because his shares are more valuable than the underlying Bitcoin he holds. And that's the essence of this kind of accretive Bitcoin purchasing. So shares are diluted or increased by 5%, Bitcoin's increased by 10%, shareholders are happy, they have more Bitcoin and per share.
Yeah, one of the ways that I like to simplify it when I talk to people about this stock and this opportunity is that equities in the public market are forward-looking. That's why we see PE ratios where something like NVIDIA could trade at 300 times its current annual revenues. And so it's this forward-looking nature of public equities that allows these stocks to have a premium, a multiple on their current earnings. And when you have Bitcoin on your balance sheet, well, Bitcoin itself trades at whatever the current market rate is, right? You could say that the forward-looking catalysts for Bitcoin are somewhat priced in, but really Bitcoin trades at a free market rate. And the thing that I actually think that Saylor and MicroStrategy are shorting is not so much the US dollar as it is the forward-looking nature of public equities, which is basically saying, okay, we can't price MSTR at today's Bitcoin. We have to price it at the future Bitcoin that they might acquire and what that future Bitcoin might be priced at. And that essentially provides the gap that, MSTR can selectively close by issuing shares and buying more Bitcoin. And basically, when people talk about MNAV, there would be no accretive dilution if it was not for the gap. If there was not a MNAV greater than 1, there would not be accretive dilution. And so I think that that's something that the MNAV, 130 IQ versus 80 IQ folks are kind of talking past each other on.
That's a good point, Chase, because if it's selling for like 3 to 4x value, but in the future where Bitcoin's going to be worth more than gold, which is 10x from here, it's like I'm willing to deal with that volatility in the short term in order to hold this thing 10 years later when I know Bitcoin's true value is going to be realized, right? That's kind of like the general basic idea, yeah. And you're right. Yeah, the 80 IQ. I mean, and you guys clearly are not 80 IQ autists like we joke about on Twitter. You're in the financials, you're running the numbers. This is far more complicated, but there really is the play. And I'm not 80 IQ, but I just went in my retirement account, bought some MicroStrategy and sat back and just watched the fireworks as you guys tell the story online and just get everybody excited. But I think the thing that's really interesting to me is I want to bring it back to what you were asking earlier, Chase, is how far can this go? Can someone catch up? And I think, in my mind, is it could go one or two ways, and this is a very simple view, and y'all kind of course correct me, but either it does continue for a long time, and there'll be volatility way down the line, or everyone has to bend the knee and take the same strategy because of what Bitcoin is, and MicroStrategy is kind of enshrined as the greatest finance story of all time. Are there any other options? Forgive the bull sentiment.
No, I think you're spot on, and I think it's a really interesting conversation to have because a lot of people have different views on whether or not companies will transition to a fully sort of MicroStrategy playbook, which is issuing those fixed income products and selling shares to increase their Bitcoin per share? Or will companies just use their cash to buy Bitcoin and have that accrete value for their shareholders? Will all companies go to the same extreme that MicroStrategy has? And my personal view is that I don't think so. I think companies will have to buy Bitcoin to fight off the inflationary effects of the cash they hold on their balance sheet. I think that will become an imperative. But this MicroStrategy playbook, the debt, the at-the-money selling, the options market that allows for such crazy volatility, and the selling even more convertible debt, the only way you can have a company that offers those products is if almost 100% of their value is derived from the underlying Bitcoin. And so I think for a lot of companies, they're going to start by acquiring Bitcoin and just holding it. And that's perfect and that's great. And I think it's something that as we move forward, all of us, especially you guys, as you're doing this in real time, it's something that I think people are going to have to navigate for themselves, and companies for themselves are going to have to navigate. Okay, we don't have to do this MicroStrategy full thing. We can just buy Bitcoin and hold it. And that's still hugely advantageous.
Yeah. Or maybe purely equity-based capital raises with investors who are, eager to invest in the business and are kind of signing off on taking that equity capital raise and acquiring Bitcoin for the balance sheet. There you're not taking on any leverage. Definitely what MicroStrategy is doing, being 150% long Bitcoin, is unique. And so one other thing I wanted to make sure we touch on is in Saylor's recent earnings call, which basically became a podcast or webinar, he really went into this idea that they are basically a refinery, and that they're taking crude capital that perhaps doesn't have access to Bitcoin, and they're refining it through these different products that they're making available, all this different financial engineering, and they're allowing crude capital entry into Bitcoin through their vehicles. So Dan or Tim, maybe you guys can speak to this larger idea that they seem to have really clarified amongst themselves now.
I'll let Dan get into the weeds. I'll just mention that literally 2 days ago, I got a text message from a colleague of mine in my day job, which is buying mineral and royalty streams in the oil and gas industry. He literally sent me the crude oil refinery slide from the earnings call, and he said, "I get it now." And I was like, that's so cool. And it obviously just underscores the more that we can analogize and relate and connect and make it click and walk through different doors to get people to understand what's going on. I think that's really powerful. It just happened to be that, right, they did the oil refinery analogy, and it just happened to be an oil guy. He was like, oh my gosh, he's smashed by MicroStrategy.
No, I think you're totally right. And analogies are important when you're dealing with internet money and super intangible ideas and bond markets and all this kind of crazy stuff. In terms of the refinery, yeah, I think it's just the perfect analogy, right? Because the underpinning of it, I think, is equity as a product. And so MicroStrategy is selling their equity, which has this high volatility and a leveraged Bitcoin proxy per se. And so it's attractive to a lot of different people. And on that slide, I know he had MSTR options at the very top, highest volatility, 5x to 10x Bitcoin's price leverage on Bitcoin. At the bottom, I think he had the fixed income, the fixed coupon, non-convertible debt, and then the convertible debt, and then the equity, and then the leverage ETFs on MicroStrategy. And so I think all those products are very valuable. And what he's trying to show is that there's so much money out there. There is so much trapped capital, and he said this before. And when you create this equity product, which he has, it gives investors a tool to create their own portfolios. And he said that before as well. And so I think that's really the key here is he's only been able to implement this because he's been leveraged along Bitcoin in a single direction and has been able to tap into the capital markets in a way that other companies haven't, right? And only a publicly traded company could do that. So I think it goes back to our point is different companies will have different strategies here. But if you're a publicly traded company, you have these tools at your disposal, and you can, you can give someone a convertible debt like product with limited upside and protected downside, or you can give them a highly leveraged product as a form of options on the equity, which just arises naturally for a highly volatile stock.
I think similar to most people covering the MicroStrategy story, we talk a lot about how it's one of the best performing stocks, if not the best performing stock, how genius it is, and how, folks may not be able to catch up to them. We've discussed this, but what are the risks to this strategy that they're working on? Like what could go wrong here theoretically?
I've been listening to too many people making the bull case, so I might need a bit on this one. I think Saylor said this himself, just market conditions. So he's not going to sell, well, what's back up? The announcement yesterday, he used the rest of the 800 and some million from the last ATM, but then unless I'm wrong and Ben's wrong and Jeff's wrong, which I don't think they are, he's already used $1 billion of this $21 billion ATM. And the MNAV just went up. The stock just went up while he was doing it. It was like, what? You sold $1 billion additional into the market already? So, if the market would change, I don't see him selling additional shares and taking the multiple net asset value negative. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of other, all these disclosures, and there's many risk factors, but that's the one that comes to my mind to kind of start with.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And if you read the 10K, obviously there's a ton of risks associated with any publicly traded equity or any equity in general, and it's something to consider. MNAV compression to sub 1, which happened during the last bear market, would be difficult to navigate. It would be difficult to navigate temporarily. And it's something a lot of people talk about. Well, the MNAV will compress. Won't the strategy go to hell? And I don't think so. The MNAV would have to be sustained below 1 for a very long period of time for this strategy to fail. And the only way in which I think that's viable is if the sentiment regarding Bitcoin falls so low that people, even Bitcoin maxis, decide it's going to zero. Because it's kind of like a bicycle wheel. You have to start spinning it to get it going. And that's what MicroStrategy's done, right? They've created this leverage, which justifies a small premium. And as long as they have that small premium, they can do their typical capital markets activities. They're at the market selling, which will be accretive. Their convertible debt offerings, which will be accretive. So as long as there's a slight premium justified by the leverage, because Bitcoin's going up in the long run, you're going to be okay. Aside from other sort of just equity-related risks, key man risk, management risk, government seizure risk. There's a gazillion risks associated with public equities, but in terms of the actual strategy, I think it's Bitcoin sentiment turns hugely big. It's pretty much Bitcoin failing, and that's the same risk as owning Bitcoin. So in terms of the strategy, I think it's coherent.
One thing that I would actually add to that, Dan, is if MNAV goes negative, well, Saylor has another lever to pull, which is he could just buy back his own stock, because at that point, share buybacks becomes accretive again, because you're buying back your stock when it's undervalued to the existing Bitcoin holdings. So he doesn't always have to issue shares. He actually could do traditional buybacks, and that's what he could do if MNAV is ever under 1, and that could bring it back up to 1. And so, Mason, just to kind of how I would quickly answer your question, it reminded me of when people ask, what are the risks to Bitcoin itself? And, we often hear people say, well, the risk to Bitcoin is that governments balance their budgets and stop printing money. And, people joke, okay, that's never going to happen. Well, what I think the risk to MSTR's playbook here is that price to earnings ratios come way back into reason, and that the bond market starts to provide bonds with interest rates that are above true inflation. I guess those to me would be the two things that, if the market conditions changed in that way, then MSTR's play becomes a lot less attractive, and it would attract a lot less capital. But again, it's similar to governments balancing their budgets, where you kind of laugh at it yeah, that's probably not going to happen anytime soon.
Good call outs, good insights. I personally wish that they would talk more about their custodial solution, I know it sounds like I'm talking our own book, but I mean, none of this really matters if they lose the Bitcoin. So I would love to hear more about how they approach that. But moving on, I think, last question or so from me is what are the MicroStrategy catalysts coming up, let's say for the rest of this year and for 2025? We've had such a big run up. Like what could make this run continue?
I guess I'll start off with there's literally so many catalysts that my friend Max started a website called mstrmoon.com. And it has the price of MSTR and it has literally a laundry list of catalysts. And yeah, we could go down some of those. I don't know if any of you guys want to kind of talk through some of them, but yeah, it's in the same way that Dan was talking about so many moving parts. And even Chase, right? It's like, well, he can sell shares or he can buy back shares. It's almost like he's just this conductor. And yeah, it's pretty wild actually trying to think through the whole thing and how many levers there are.
Yeah, Dan, do you want to talk through index inclusion and maybe some other catalysts? You already mentioned that index inclusion means passive inflows, non-price sensitive inflows are coming into MicroStrategy and not necessarily Bitcoin, and how that can kind of set floors for the MicroStrategy price. Any other cool catalysts worth keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to chime in here. I'm definitely not the catalyst guy. A lot of the other guys in MSTR True North are better than me at that. But in terms of what's coming up, so this November 15th open interest expiration, that's an options thing. And so what that means is there's a bunch of call options, which is the right to purchase shares at a certain price. These contracts, which give owners the right to purchase MicroStrategy shares at a strike price, at a fixed price. A lot of them are in the money, meaning a lot of these holders of these options have the right to purchase MicroStrategy shares at a price that's much lower than what it's trading at right now in the free market. And so there's all these market makers out there who are trying to hedge those positions. They're trying to make it such that, so these market makers have to deliver shares to these options contract holders at a very cheap price, way below market value, right? So they're going to take a big loss. If they're not fully hedged, meaning they didn't take a long position in MicroStrategy when they sold these contracts, on this option expiration date, they're going to have to go out, buy a ton of MicroStrategy at the market price, and then sell it for cheaper to these options holders. And all this buying is necessarily going to push the price of MicroStrategy higher, right? These market makers have to purchase the shares. And that's kind of complicated. It's really hard to think about, and it's something I've been trying to think about a lot more. But that's one of two dates. January 17th is another options interest expiration date where there's a lot of in-the-money options. Passive indexes, well, 40% of all investing is passive. So that's just people buying ETFs that weight companies based on their market capitalization, and just passive money flows right into those equities. MicroStrategy's in a couple indices. The MSCI World Index is one of them. They will be rebalanced, meaning MicroStrategy will be weighted higher in the index because its market cap has increased so substantially over the past 3 months. What that means is more money will necessarily have to flow into MicroStrategy. It just means more buying, since it's market cap weighted, will have to occur. Thanksgiving, that's just talking with family. Everyone wants to buy MSTR and get rich. QQQ rank day. This is a big one. So there's qualifications for getting into any of these indices, and particularly for QQQ, there's no earnings requirement. It's really just a market cap, and there's some other criteria. MicroStrategy now has a qualifying market capitalization for QQQ inclusion, the NASDAQ 100, and there's a snapshot taken of the top 100 U.S. companies that aren't financial companies on November 29th, 2024. And this is when they use the market cap to rank those companies upon rebalancing. So it looks like MicroStrategy will get included, but there may be some caveat that prevents that from happening. But the snapshot's taken on November 29th, December 13th, the announcement comes out, and then rebalancing should occur on December 20th. And so rebalancing means MicroStrategy, in theory, would be included into the QQQ index. Tons of passive money would flow, which would boost the market cap. And ultimately the share price. So those are the big catalysts so far looking forward. And then the one other one I want to talk about is this FASB accounting. And during the earnings call, it was mentioned that FASB, which is a new form of digital asset accounting, will be included in the income statement Q1 2025. And what this means is that the fair asset value of MicroStrategy's Bitcoin holdings will be marked on their asset balance sheet. Right now, if you go through their 10Q or 10K reports, they only own like 7 billion worth of Bitcoin because they have to mark it at the lowest price during the entire quarter, and they can't mark up the value of their Bitcoin. Similarly, the increase in Bitcoin price starting on the date that the new accounting rules are adopted, which is January 1st, 2025, any price increase in Bitcoin will be included in their net income statement as investment income and will directly carry down to their price to earnings ratio. So earnings will have a huge jump if Bitcoin's price continues to climb through Q1 2025, where earnings are right now negative and the increase in MicroStrategy's Bitcoin value is not included on the income statement. It can only be marked down. So these are huge bullish factors that are tough to quantify how exactly they'll play out. If there's a lot of algorithms that trade on price to earnings ratios, then maybe MicroStrategy will get a huge boost in terms of buying, or maybe a lot of investors will try to front run this FASB inclusion, which ultimately will qualify them for S&P 500 index inclusion towards the latter half of 2025.
Dan, do you think that this is going to, when the FASB kicks in and MSTR announces their Q1 earnings and we see earnings per share, do you expect this to be the biggest ever change in earnings per share that the market has ever seen? And, what do you expect? Is that going to be the official wake-up call to traditional investors?
I think it's a good question. And the way I understand it, it all depends what Bitcoin does Q1 2025. Depending on how much it increases, that's going to have the direct effect on the actual earnings that are seen in the Q1 2025 earnings report. However, their asset value will be marked up almost 300%. So that will be a big change. And I think, I know Ryan and Jeff, those guys have done better analysis on the exact earnings per share that will be accounted for based on this FASB adoption. However, it will be positive, that's for sure. Do I think it will be the wake up? I think leading into Q1 2025, like the market participants are smart. A lot of people are very conventional thinkers, so they don't understand this sort of change. But I do think we're going to see a huge front running of this event. Most people are aware of FASB and they understand what it means for potential QQQ or potential S&P 500 inclusion. So I think it's going to be a monumental change that people will start to anticipate over the next 6 months.
Nice. Well, Dan, Tim, this has been super informative for us, especially for myself, because I'm not too deep into the MicroStrategy weeds, but you guys certainly are. So appreciate all the insights and, give the people where to follow you and where to find your socials.
Yeah, it's Tim Kotzman on X, and that's about it. I literally post the videos that I do to LinkedIn and Facebook, and they get like 3 likes. So I'm just on X now. It's just a fun social. It's a fun social experiment to see that there's like 5 likes and 1 reshare on LinkedIn, where I have like almost 11,000 followers, and there's like 3 likes. And this includes like my friends and family, right? No one cares. Everyone's asleep. No one knows what's going on unless you're on X. So you can find me on X. And thanks for having me, guys. It's been awesome.
And the Tim Kotzman Show on YouTube, right?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
And I'm just, you'll see me on the Tim Kotzman Show as well. I try to get on as much as I can. I think it's going to be the biggest thing 2025, biggest thing on X, biggest thing on YouTube. But I'm just Danny85732 on Twitter. That's it.
Yeah, and a quick call out to the MSTR True North gang and Quant Bros and a lot of great other MSTR related content creators doing good work like you guys are. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. Quick reminder that New Foundations is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment, financial, or legal advice. Business owners, business operators, and those who are Bitcoin curious, let's connect. Visit acropolistreasury.com to learn more or to get in touch with our team.